Welcome to the Reaching Up Podcast. I'm Ron Farris.
And I'm Daniel Locke.
And this episode, we are talking about boundaries.
Yes.
So boundaries, personal boundaries are limits and rules that we set for ourselves within our relationships. So these are rules that we live by personally or in relationships with other people.
Very much a buzzword right now.
Yeah, you hear a lot about boundaries, and most guys, when you say, let's talk about boundaries, they go, what? Huh? What? But, and I did the same thing.
That's what I was about to say. I'd never heard of them either.
Boundaries is one of those things you don't have to know anything about until you have to know everything about it. And it's like really quick because your life depends on it. But so boundaries, another way of looking at them, are simply the lines we draw for ourselves in terms of our level of comfort around others, or areas of behavior that we will or will not allow in our personal space, either our behavior or somebody else's.
What we will choose to accept, what we will not choose to accept.
That's right. One of my favorite explanations of boundaries that I have seen is in recovery circles. You will hear people talk about setting circles for ourselves, where we have sort of a green circle. And in that green circle, we put all the things that we can do safely that don't pose any harm or risk to us or to others. And then there'll be like a yellow circle where these are behaviors that we really should try to avoid because they may be triggers for other behavior or thresholds for other behavior. And then there's a red circle where these are things that we should never do. If we do those things, then we have failed on some level. And I like that. That's sort of a nice picture of boundaries, and it's in color, so it's a lot of fun, to have. And you want to live in that green circle kind of thing. Stay out of the yellow. The yellow is sort of like your check engine light, as you say, to proceed with great caution, which is, of course, what yellow means on the red light. And then red light means, stop, don't do this. We've got a boundary failure of some kind. So there are all kinds of boundaries, as it turns out. And I've learned that this is incredibly important to understand, that boundaries are sometimes maybe flexible, but there are many, many kinds. And one of the things that I've understood from looking into, this topic this week, getting ready, is that it's not uncommon for human beings to be like really great at boundaries in one area and really suck at boundaries in another area. Yeah. So areas where we see boundaries that are important are in our emotions. We talk about emotions, but we set boundaries and expect other people to respect our boundaries to protect our emotional well-being. Physical boundaries, protect our physical space. This is my space. I need you to stay over there out of my space. Yeah. Sexual boundaries. We have to protect our needs and our safety sexually. And, that's pretty easy to figure out. Time boundaries. I am willing to give you so much of my time, but beyond that, I'm not willing to give you any of my time. And that's a boundary that we have to set sometimes with people, because some people want more of our time than we have to give based on our priorities. Intellectual boundaries. I'm not going to talk about this topic with you because we can't do it successfully. Yeah. And we certainly probably experienced that. More and more people are getting more and more opinionated, and I was, hearing today about somebody that was talking about something like Trump syndrome or something, where you just have to mention Donald Trump's name to some people and it just sets them off into a rage that they can't control. And, so that's boundary failure for them. You probably don't need to talk about that if it's going to make you go crazy. Yeah. Verbal boundaries. We decide sometimes that we're just not going to say something, or we're going to disclose things up to a point. But the point is, there are things that where we draw the line and we say to ourselves, I'm not going to talk about this, or I'm not going to talk about this with this person. Yeah. Or I'm only going to talk about these things with this person, a priest or a lawyer or a counselor. Workplace boundaries. I know you know about this. You work in a workplace with lots of other people. I don't. I tend to work, pretty much by myself a lot of the day. in my law practice, but I've owned a law firm with 70 employees, and I do know that there are a lot of needs for boundaries when you are in an office with people all day, every day.
Yes.
And there's a constant need to retool and refix and affirm those boundaries, and it just wears you out. It's one reason I like working alone. And then there are financial boundaries. I'm not going to spend more money than I make. Yeah. That's a good one. Yeah. I'm not going to borrow money. I'm going to live off of what I make and not somebody else's money that I have to repay with interest. So these are all examples of boundaries. So obviously life is full of boundaries, boundaries at work, boundaries at home, boundaries with other people in our life, and boundaries when we're out with our buddies, even when we're trying to have a good time. There's still boundaries that need to be functioning. And of course, we all know that a lot of people talk about, alcohol or drugs complicating that process, because a lot of times when we use substances that change the way we think, our boundaries start to move around on us. Mm-hmm. And I had a therapist one time to tell me that addiction is really, in a short description, is catastrophic boundary failure. Mm-hmm. So boundaries are important. We need to understand them.
Yeah, and they're everywhere. And I did not know. I won't we on everybody, but I did not know that they were just a part of everything. Like, it's a normal social construct in a way, because mm-hmm. like we realize it until it becomes unhealthy, basically. So I like that. And so I think and being able to understand it helped when I said boundaries. So it's a lot with our relationships is where I see it most in my life, where I need to be able to have strong boundaries. And so for me, it enables my healthy relationships, because you can have unhealthy relationships in a way. But I like it. It says boundaries clearly define ourselves and our limits and how we can interact with others in a way that fosters respect and responsibility. Without boundaries, relationships can become enmeshed, unhealthy, or damaging. So without boundaries, so practical side of it, if I always feel like I have to do something for this person to make me happy, or to make this person happy, mm-hmm. or I always feel like, well, they'll expect me to do this, I'm expected to do this, I have to do this, then that takes away the ability to me to choose to do something. It can be the exact same thing, mm-hmm. but if I do it because I feel like they expect me to do it, there's almost a resentment there. Mm-hmm. Or there is room for resentment. Or if I'm doing it because I want to, it makes it easier. I'm like, I want to do this because, and you can fill in the blank, mm-hmm. instead of I have to do this because they want me to. Mm-hmm. And so it just changes our motivation. It changes how I enjoy things if I do something because I want to, even if it's the exact same thing. It's just how your mindset is. But yeah, that's how I kind of see it. A lot of it is just a relationship, but you can, just like you said, it's in so many areas. It's what am I responsible for? Mm-hmm. I'm responsible for a 40-hour work week to my boss. How stringent I am with that can vary. Well, I'm going to leave at 38 because that's what I want to. Mm-hmm. Or, well, I gotta go at least 45 so they'll be happy, even though you're only getting paid for 40. Technically, that's a boundary. That's a boundary that you're willing to cross, or you are crossing. How much time you're going to spend with your family. Like I'm thinking about those things as I'm getting closer to, hopefully my wife and I start a family. And so mm-hmm. I'm thinking about these things. What is it going to look like to have a productive career, but also want to be at home enough to where I can spend time with my family, but I want them to have things. So it's a whole bunch of different things. So these will be figured out as we go. I don't have answers for them yet.
Well, I think it's great, absolutely great that you're thinking about those things now before it actually happens, because I can tell you once the child is born, and then if you choose to expand your family, the second child is born, say, or the third or whatever, the next thing you know, you don't have time to sit around and think about what your boundaries should be. You're just scrambling to try to, get it done, get everything, keep the plate spinning in the air. Yeah. And so it's great that you can think about these things now. And that you raised a couple of great examples of places where boundaries really do function. And for the purposes of this podcast, it gives a very clear example of how boundaries work or don't work. One of those is like in work. When you've got somebody at work that's, that seems to be pushing you to give more than what you bargained for, mm-hmm. that's a boundary failure. And one of the hard, this is a great example of how hard it is sometimes to deal with boundaries, because in that situation, what's probably going to happen, if nothing is done to specific by you or by someone to specifically address the problem, then you're just going to be pushed for more and more, and it's going to go until it reaches a breaking point. And then that's rarely the great time to have that conversation or to try to deal with that issue when it's become a crisis. So one of the things that I've learned about boundaries myself, because I didn't know anything about boundaries at a point. The first time a boundary conversation came up, I was in a therapy session. My life was sort of in a state of upheaval because I had catastrophic boundary failure. And I was having to learn that there were such things as boundaries. And it made perfect sense when I heard it. And I thought, why did I not think about this or realize this myself? But, the boundaries are, as you said, things that you tell yourself you're going to do or not going to do. I'm going to work, I'm going to give all of my patients 40 minutes, just like they paid for, or instead of 38. There's probably some business model somewhere that says, well, you can give them 35, and you can spend that last 5 escorting them out, and, you can get more people in or whatever, stay on track, whatever, blah, blah. But whenever you get into a situation where you are telling yourself, I'm going to do this way because it's important to me to do it that way, then there are two types of accountability that come in there. One is the accountability to the person that you're doing it for. That person, you decided they deserve 40 minutes. They paid for 40 minutes. You're going to give them 40 minutes of physical therapy. But there's also accountability to yourself. If you're clipping that time, each patient, and patients may not, and I'm not saying you do this, theoretically, if the patients are not noticing it, then you're breaching your own boundary. And one of the solutions to boundary issues is for us just to be very, very self-aware of the fact that we need boundaries and what boundaries we need and how important they are to set. And then once we decide that, a lot of times the hard part is to set that boundary. It's easier to set boundaries on myself. I'm going to work out 3 days a week. I'm going to stay in the gym for an hour each day at least. I'm going to get cardio in, 2 days a week, at least 3. I'm going to do abs, 2 days a week. I mean, those are personal boundaries. We might call them goals, but those are really boundaries. It's saying that, I'm going to do this. And if I don't do this, then I'm not performing as I intend, as I think I should. But it's a different thing altogether to say, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to commit to work out with you. And so if I don't show up for my hour on Tuesday, then I've not only breached my boundary to myself, but my boundary has also caused you harm. So it's a lot harder then for me to make a commitment to you and say, we need to talk about this. You've not been showing up. You said you'd be there at 3 o'clock every day. And, I'm there at 3 o'clock. I'm ready to go. And you're showing up at 3:20. Yeah. And that's what we're doing there. It sounds like a problem, but really what it is it's boundary failure. You set a boundary with me. You said that you would honor the 3 o'clock meetup time. But you're not doing it. And I consistently find that people who do that, and I have done this, they do it over and over again. It's like they don't have a problem with bending their boundaries. It's just no big deal. And that is an example of how if we want to be successful, we need to pay close attention and be self-aware of our own, to make ourselves accountable for our own boundaries, and then to constantly look back at those boundaries and see if they're working or if we're honoring them, and have some method of checking ourselves to make sure that we're meeting our boundaries. And then, of course, you and I are friends, and we are in different groups, that are sort of like accountability groups, where guys are trying to hold other guys accountable for whatever. And in that process, we have other people who can look at us and say, Ron, you said you were going to do this, but, I haven't been seeing you do that lately, or you said you were going to be here every week at this meeting and you're not, you've been missing a lot. What's up? That is an example of our friends and relationships helping keep us accountable for our boundaries.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good example of what that actually looks like. And so going back just a little bit to what you said about not meeting a boundary, not meeting something that you said. Let me say it like this. So if you've told me that you're going to meet me at 3:00, just like you said, we're going to go work out, we're going to do something.
That's the boundary.
We're
going to meet at 3:00.
Yeah. So you don't show up. So then what would you think of is a healthy conversation or a healthy way for me to say, hey, this person how they're acting is impacting me because I've set aside 3:00 to 4:00. I'd like to be home at 4:30. It's my night to cook dinner. So
you've got that boundary at home. And
yes.
if somebody messes up on one, then it's going to throw you off on the others.
Exactly.
So there is an effect.
So what's a conversation, or how would you recommend having a conversation? And we're going to use this context, but you can put it in other context of addressing someone like, hey, what you're doing is affecting me in this way. I value our friendship. I would like us to be able to work out, and it's very difficult when you do this. What verbiage would you use?
I can give you some general rules on that I try to live by. One of them is that you deal with it promptly. You don't let it roll, because if the longer you go in that situation, if it doesn't immediately correct, like if it's a one-time deal, then, I might give a little grace on that. But if it happens the second time, then I think I should deal with it as quickly as possible. And this is assuming that the other person is failing on the boundary, on honoring the boundary. And then the conversation is sort of like, look, man, I know we're both busy and we've got a lot going on, but if we're gonna say 3:00, we need to try to stick to it. I really need to start at 3 because I have a commitment at 4:30. And if we start at 3:15, then this workout's not really nearly what I'm hoping it would be. And we both, want to make this work. I mean, there's again, one point you can take away from our episode today is that boundary setting is hard to do. If it involves another person, it can be a very awkward thing. And nobody seems to want to acknowledge, except people who are like in years and years of therapy, will acknowledge that boundaries are so very important. Most of us just sort of live like, look, I'm doing the best I can, man. I'll show up. If I could have been there at 4, I'd have been there at 4, and that kind of thing, though, is really and truly just making excuses for failing to honor boundaries that we've set. The rule on that would be, look, if you can't be here at 4 every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, then tell me. Yeah. Let's just be honest about it. And a friendship, really and truly, you think about it, a friendship, and this is true, I'm going to say for any relationship. We'll talk about friendship first, and then we're going to talk about like marriage. Somebody that you're fully committed to live in a reliable relationship with them. It's the same rules apply both, though. Really, setting boundaries is important. We need to talk about those areas in our life where we need to have some boundaries set. An example of that in a relationship would be, I want to, coordinate my efforts with you to work out. I'm more productive in the weight room if you're there. So, we can spot each other, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a million reasons how you can benefit from working out with somebody else. It just keeps you motivated and it pushes you on, and you can always push past your own personal limits when there's somebody there to grab the bar, and save you from embarrassment, certain embarrassment. I did that the other day in the gym for a guy that didn't have anybody. And it was like, dude, you need to have a spotter here if you're going to put that much weight on that bar, by yourself. But, that's an area where the boundaries are really helpful to try to set that up. But once we set them up, like you say, if you fail to honor them, it's going to have a negative consequence. And in some cases, they can be very serious, we're going to record this podcast at 6:15 in the morning, and if you show up at 6:45, we're going to have a problem, right? And you never do that. So So we don't have that problem. But in a relationship like a marriage, an example of a boundary around the workout thing, just to keep with that metaphor, since, some guys out there will be able to identify with this 100%, is, if I'm going to work out, let's say in the afternoons after work, because I can't work out during the day, I'm going to work out from, let's say, 5:30 to 6:30 or 5:30 to 6:45 or 5:30 to 7, then if I am getting phone calls from home, about, what'd you do about this today? This is happening with the kids or whatever, it might be necessary for me to try to establish a boundary with the person calling me. In this case, maybe my spouse or my kids, anybody that, look, I work out from 5:30 to 7. I really need, if we've got business to do, unless it's an emergency, I'd appreciate it if you just let me have that time to focus on my workout. That is a boundary. Mm-hmm. And that, again, it may be an awkward conversation to have, but if you don't have it, what's likely to happen is that there's going to be resentment that sets in. There's going to be anger. There's going to be probably at some point some explosion because the boundary failure made you, got inside your head, is rattling around. The next thing you know, you've got a resentment. And of course, we've already done an episode on resentment. So you can go listen to that about how to deal with those. But boundaries are just a way to get it right from the beginning. Yeah. And then it's critically important that you honor those boundaries, both your own boundaries to yourself and the boundaries that you set with other people. Yeah. And that you continually go back and check those boundaries and see if you need to adjust them, as we live life and as our priorities change and as our time gets more constricted, like with the birth of children and increases in responsibility at work and, all the things that come with just getting older and more mature and taking on more responsibility. We have to really use boundaries to make us more efficient and more productive and to keep us sane. Yeah. And that is one of those things. So talking about boundaries, though, there are healthy boundaries and there are unhealthy boundaries. Mm-hmm. And this is true in everything, right? Just about any topic you pick up, there's a way to go to one extreme or the other. You don't do it enough, or you don't do it at all, or you overdo it. I'm one of those people who probably tends to overdo things. There are some people who have rigid boundaries. Yeah. Those people tend to avoid intimacy and close relationships. They are unlikely to ask for help. Mm-hmm. You meet a lot of people in the addiction community who have done a lot of unnecessary suffering because they were unwilling to ask for help or to admit to someone else that they needed help. These people that have rigid boundaries have very few close relationships because they don't trust other people. Yeah. They don't believe that other people will act in their best interest. And that could come from the way they were raised or some traumatic experience they had with a bad parent or, with some, who knows, it could come from any number of places. Mm-hmm. These people are very protective of their personal information. They don't want you in their space. They don't want to let you in. They may seem detached even with romantic partners. They may even be, in a relationship like a marriage, and they are aloof and unavailable emotionally. Yeah. And that can, of course, do a lot of damage to the other person. And it's not very good for the person who's doing it either. Yeah. And then these are the people who keep others at a distance to possibly avoid the possibility of rejection, because the fear of rejection is one of the strongest fears out there. Yeah. So if you are one of those people, then you need to probably, if you're listening to this podcast, stop and say, hey, time out. My boundaries may be a little bit too rigid here, and I need to loosen up my boundaries and let some more experiences in, give somebody out there a chance to actually come more into my life and experience life with me. Mm-hmm. There are porous boundaries. This is just the opposite, where people have they just have virtually no boundaries. These are the people who consistently give you TMI, too much information. In the conversation or in the meeting, they talk about things they just really and truly shouldn't be talking about. Yeah. And I know you've met people like this. Mm-hmm. These are the people who have difficulty saying no to the requests of other people. They just can't say no. And they're constantly just being a doormat for other people because they don't know how to say no, or I don't want you to do that, or please stop doing that, or please, I cannot do what you want me to do. You mentioned that a minute ago, that some people act consistently, try to make somebody else happy.
Yeah.
That's never going to be healthy because it's not respectful of the boundaries that you need to get your own needs met, but, to just live a healthy life. These people who have porous boundaries are dependent on the opinions of other people. They really aren't self-confident at all. They are very desperately in need of other people's approval. They fear rejection, just will do anything to avoid rejection. And then there are people who have healthy boundaries, which is what we're hoping, is the goal for anybody listening. They value their own opinions. They value other people's opinions. They can listen to somebody else's opinion that they disagree with, and they are able to, understand, look for the value in it, look maybe for the similarities instead of the differences. And then they take what's good, they leave the rest. They can walk away from that conversation without being shaken or offended, or aggravated or angry. They're getting a very healthy exchange of information with people as they come and go.
Yeah. I think two things I want to respond to that you've mentioned that are really good. And I don't know, when you're saying when people try to, it's as you try to begin to establish boundaries, it can be weird. It'll be weird for those around you. It'll also be weird for you to be able to say no. But the thing I was thinking, like, I would much prefer to say passive aggressive comments until the other person figures it out how they're doing something that is not favorable to me. Like if I could not confront somebody, I'll do it. I'd rather have passive aggressive comments and then figure it out, which sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud, but that's how we do life a lot. I'm going to just say little things and you're going to be like, dang, that was kind of mean. Maybe I should change myself and become a better person. When has that ever worked? Never.
Never.
And as I say it, it's funny. If my wife listens to this, she'll laugh so hard at this because this has been a big area of growth for me. But the two things you said, and I want us to hear it well, is when you're talking about setting that workout time. I think it can be easy if we try to. It can be easy for a boundary to come across as something selfish if we don't communicate it well. Because this has happened. That's why I was laughing at this. So it's happened. And when I was having a conversation with my wife, it was, hey, I would like to work out. I need to work out. I don't remember exactly what I said. I was like, I need to work out for this hour. Like, I find enjoyment in this. The first time I said it, it came across as, I don't want to spend time with you. I would rather be by myself or whatever. When I can reword it, and we had another conversation about it, it was, hey, I enjoy this thing, and it allows me to decompress. It allows me to process the day. I enjoy doing it in the evenings, right before dinner. I enjoy it right after I get off work. It just helps me calm down. I want to be able to do this so I can be more present with you when I get home. So is it all right if this hour, unless it's an emergency, you just let me try to have this time, and then when I come home, I will be very present for you, and we can talk about the day and try to schedule a little bit. So when I had that conversation, it went from her seeing this as just me wanting to do it because selfishly I want my hour of workout time to, hey, this is helpful for me, and I think it will be helpful for us if we're able to do that. And I'm sure that will change eventually, the times or whatever. But
that's a great example, though, of how to set a boundary, and that is a great example of a boundary that is important to set because it's dealing with your physical health, your mental health, your spiritual health, the health of your relationship. Yeah. And it is incredibly important, but I'm going to acknowledge it's extremely hard to learn to set boundaries with like the people that you love the most.
Absolutely.
Another example of that would be like when you get married and you have kids, then all of a sudden you may have a problem with the grandparents showing up unannounced or too frequently. And I've experienced that problem, setting those boundaries with your parents about, what you will and will not tolerate as far as their children. We caught one of our children's grandparents, showing them, movies that were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that, my 8-year-old child watched this movie. But grandma wasn't really paying a whole lot of attention. She just had all the movies in there and
Look,
and the video,
sometimes Rambo's just on in the background and your 8-year-old self's like, this
we were
is
starting
crazy.
to hear
Wow.
words and things, and we were thinking, where are you hearing this stuff? It was like, mammals, But anyway, that's an example of where you may have to set boundaries with somebody like a grandparent. At work, sometimes you may have to ask a coworker not to put stuff on your desk, or to come into your office without asking, or to honor your production time and, save the office gossip conversation to break or lunch. Yeah. Those are all examples of boundaries that will make the relationship better and will make you happier as a person and certainly more successful in maintaining your mental health. So we need to wrap it up. Any final thoughts on the importance of boundaries, of healthy boundaries?
I think just summarizing what we already talked about is just the boundaries indicate what we're responsible for and what we're not. And so you mentioned something of being able to say no. And so just knowing what we're able to give. If I tell you I'm going to work 40 hours a week, you're going to get my absolute best for 40 hours. And then we'll have to talk about what's after that. Like there's always leeway there, but if I have to be able to get to the point where I can say, hey, I want to do that. I don't have the capacity for that right now. I do have other things going on. And if I say yes to you, other commitments I have said will suffer. So being able to comfortably know who you are, know what you're responsible for, know that it's not all dependent on you all the time. And you can say, no, I've already set this time aside, instead of pushing something else because you don't want to tell somebody no.
That's right. And it may be a little awkward at first, but with practice, like anything, it becomes a lot easier. And once you master it, your life's going to be infinitely better.
100%.
So we've set a boundary on these episodes at around half an hour. So we are out of time.
We're out of time. If there's a book I'll recommend, it's the book Changes That Heal by Dr. Henry Cloud.
Okay.
That one's been a good one. I'm still working through it, but it talks a lot about boundaries in a lot more detail. So it kind of explains the meat behind it. Okay. I'll put that plug before we finish up.
Outstanding. Well, thanks for listening to the Reaching Up podcast today on our episode about boundaries. If you're on YouTube, be sure and hit that like button. While you're at it, subscribe and tap that bell so you'll be sure to get our next episode. If you're listening on Spotify, iHeart, Apple Podcast, be sure and follow us. Rate our episodes for us on Spotify if you're willing, and like us on iHeart, and leave us a comment on any of those platforms. Check us out on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Reach out to us if you'd like. We'd love to hear your comments. The email address is contact@reachinguppodcast.com. Next episode, we'll talk about honesty. That's it for this time. Thanks for listening.